I'm Rachel, 29 years old, and I'll never forget the night my family told me I was wasting my life while my business partner sat quietly in the corner, knowing exactly what he was about to reveal. What happened next completely changed how my family saw me forever, and honestly, I'm still processing it all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Morrison household meant understanding your place in a very specific hierarchy, and mine was firmly at the bottom. My parents, David and Linda Morrison, had built their lives around predictable success stories. My father worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, the kind of steady corporate job that came with a pension plan and health benefits. My mother taught high school mathematics for 32 years before retiring with full benefits and a comfortable nest egg. They believed in traditional paths, measurable outcomes, and the safety of conventional choices. My older brother Marcus embodied everything they value. He graduated summa cum laude from State University with a degree in accounting, passed his CPA exam on the first try, and landed a position at one of the city's most respected accounting firms. By 26, he was married to Jennifer, a lovely woman, who worked as a nurse practitioner. They lived in a modest but well-maintained suburban home with a white picket fence, 2 cars in the driveway, and a 5-year plan that included children and a larger house in the better school district. My younger sister Emma followed a similarly approved trajectory. She studied elementary education, graduated with honors, and secured a teaching position at the same school where my mother had taught for decades. At 25, she was engaged to Tom, a police officer from a respected local family. Their wedding was planned for the following spring, complete with a reception at the country club and a honeymoon cruise that Tom's parents had gifted them. Then there was me, Rachel Morrison, the middle child who couldn't seem to follow a straight line if her life depended on it. While Marcus was studying accounting principles and Emma was learning child development theories, I was holed up in my bedroom teaching myself graphic design software and building websites for local businesses. My parents viewed this as a hobby, something I'd eventually outgrow, once I discovered what they called real work. College was a disaster from the start. I enrolled in business administration because it seemed like something my parents could understand and respect. But I spent more time in the computer lab experimenting with digital design than I did in lecture halls. My grades reflected my divided attention, hovering consistently in the mediocre range. While my siblings brought home Dean's List certificates and academic achievement awards, I brought home barely passing grades and what my father called expensive disappointment. The breaking point came during my junior year, when I realized I was spending my tuition money on design software and online courses instead of textbooks. I discovered a passion for creating digital experiences that went far beyond simple graphic design. I was learning about user interface design, user experience principles, and the psychology behind why people interacted with digital products in specific ways. This felt like my calling, but explaining it to my parents proved impossible. When I announced I was leaving college to start my own design business, the reaction was exactly what I'd expected. My father called it throwing money down the drain. My mother cried for 3 days, convinced I was ruining my future. Marcus lectured me about financial security and responsible decision-making. Emma just looked confused, unable to understand why anyone would voluntarily leave the safety of a structured educational path. The early years of Morrison Design Studios were exactly as difficult as my family predicted they would be. I worked from my childhood bedroom, which I'd converted into a makeshift office space complete with multiple monitors, a design tablet, and enough caffeine supplies to fuel a small army. My parents tolerated this arrangement with barely concealed frustration, frequently mentioning how nice it would be if I got a real job and moved out like my siblings had. Finding clients was challenging initially. I started by redesigning websites for local restaurants, small retail shops, and service providers who needed an online presence but couldn't afford the big marketing agencies downtown. My rates were low, my experience was limited, but my enthusiasm was boundless. I approached every project like it was the most important work I'd ever do, spending hours perfecting details that clients probably never noticed. Slowly, word began to spread. The restaurant owner whose website I'd redesigned referred me to his supplier. The retail shop owner mentioned my work to her business networking group. The accountant whose online presence I'd modernized recommended me to several of his clients. Each project taught me something new about design, business, and human psychology. I was building expertise organically, learning lessons that no textbook could have taught me. What my family didn't understand was that I wasn't just creating pretty pictures or building simple websites. I was solving complex problems about how people interact with digital spaces. When a client's online sales increased by 200% after I redesigned their checkout process, that wasn't luck. When a local nonprofit saw their volunteer applications triple after I restructured their website's user flow, that was strategic design thinking in action. By my third year in business, I'd outgrown my childhood bedroom and rented a small office space downtown. Nothing fancy, just a converted storefront with good natural light and enough room for my equipment and a small meeting area. My parents viewed this as an unnecessary expense, another sign that I was being irresponsible with money. They couldn't see that having a professional space was essential for meeting with larger clients and projecting credibility. The real breakthrough came when I landed my first major corporate client. A regional medical device company needed a complete digital transformation, including a new website, user portal for their customers, and mobile application for their sales team. The project was worth more than I'd earned in my previous year combined, but more importantly, it validated everything I'd been working toward. Working with corporate clients taught me about scalability, project management, and the importance of understanding business objectives beyond just aesthetic preferences. I learned to speak the language of return on investment, user acquisition costs, and conversion rate optimization. These weren't just design projects anymore. They were business solutions that happened to involve design. As my client base expanded, I realized I needed help managing design work, client relationships, project timelines, and business development was becoming overwhelming. I needed someone who understood both the creative and business sides of what I was building. That's when I met James Peterson at a local business networking event. James was unlike anyone I'd encountered in my professional journey. At 35, he had an impressive background in business development and strategic partnerships, with experience at several Fortune 500 companies. He'd left corporate life 2 years earlier to consult with growing businesses, helping them scale their operations and develop strategic relationships. When we started talking about the challenges I was facing with Morrison Design Studios, his insights were immediately valuable. James understood the design industry in ways that surprised me. He'd worked with creative agencies during his corporate career and recognized the gap between talented designers and successful business operations. Many designers, he explained, were brilliant at solving creative problems, but struggled with the business development, strategic planning, and relationship management necessary for sustainable growth. Our initial collaboration was project-based. James helped me restructure my pricing model, develop more sophisticated project management systems, and create proposals that emphasized business value rather than just design deliverables. The results were immediate and dramatic. Clients responded more positively to proposals that spoke their language. Projects ran more smoothly with better communication systems. Most importantly, my profit margins improved significantly. After 6 months of successful collaboration, James proposed a more formal partnership. He wanted to join Morrison Design Studios as a business partner, bringing his strategic expertise and corporate connections, while I continued to lead the creative vision. The arrangement made perfect sense. I could focus on what I loved most, solving complex design problems, and creating innovative digital experiences, while James handled business development, client relationship management, and strategic planning. The partnership transformed everything. James brought contacts from his corporate career, leading to opportunities with larger companies that had more complex needs and bigger budgets. He understood how to position our services as strategic investments rather than expense items. Under his guidance, we expanded our service offerings to include digital strategy consulting, user research, and comprehensive digital transformation projects. Within 18 months of our partnership, Morrison Design Studios had grown from a one-person operation to a team of 8 talented professionals. We'd moved into a modern office space in the city's growing tech district. Our client list included several national companies, and our revenue had increased by over 400%. More importantly, we were solving increasingly complex and interesting problems, the kind of work that challenged me creatively and intellectually. Despite this success, my family's perception of my career remained stubbornly unchanged. They saw the office space and heard about the growing team, but somehow never quite grasped what we actually did or why it mattered. When they asked about my work, their questions revealed fundamental misunderstandings about both design and business. They still seemed to view what I did as some sort of elaborate hobby that happened to generate income. Family gatherings became exercises in patient explanation and gentle correction. When relatives asked what I did for a living, my parents would say something vague about computers or websites, often adding qualifiers like, "It's complicated," or "one of those new technology things." They meant well, but their inability to articulate or understand my work felt dismissive. The most frustrating part was watching how they talked about Marcus and Emma's careers. Every promotion Marcus received was celebrated and understood. When Emma implemented a new reading program in her classroom, my parents could explain exactly what that meant and why it mattered. Their pride was evident and specific. When I tried to share news about landing a major client or winning a design award, their responses were polite but vague, like they were humoring someone's unusual hobby. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This dynamic became particularly pronounced during our monthly family dinner. These gatherings had been a Morrison tradition for as long as I could remember, rotating between my parents' house and my siblings' homes. The conversations followed predictable patterns. Marcus would update everyone on his latest client acquisitions or professional certification. Emma would share stories about her students or wedding planning progress. My parents would discuss their retirement plans and social activities. When attention turned to me, the tone subtly shifted. Questions about my work were polite but superficial. Achievements were acknowledged with the kind of smile you'd give a child showing you their artwork. There was an underlying assumption that what I was doing was temporary, that eventually I'd settle into something more traditional and comprehensible. The irony was that by most objective measures, I was the most financially successful of the three siblings. Morrison Design Studios was generating revenue that exceeded Marcus's accounting salary or Emma's teaching income. We were growing rapidly, attracting high-profile clients, and building a reputation in the industry. Yet somehow, this success felt invisible to my family. James noticed this dynamic during the few family events he'd attended with me. As my business partner and close friend, he'd been included in some celebrations and casual gatherings. He was always polite and charming, but I could see him observing the family interactions with professional interest. James had extensive experience reading room dynamics from his corporate career, and he picked up on subtleties that others might miss. After one particularly frustrating family barbecue where my announcement about a major new client was overshadowed by Marcus's news about a small promotion, James asked me about it during our drive home. He wanted to understand why my family seemed so disconnected from my professional success. Was it generational differences about technology? Did they not understand the business model? Were they concerned about the stability of entrepreneurship? I tried to explain the complex family dynamics at play. My parents had built their sense of security around traditional career paths, with predictable outcomes. The corporate ladder made sense to them. Pension plans and health insurance benefits felt reliable. What I was doing felt risky and incomprehensible, even when the results suggested otherwise. James listened thoughtfully, asking occasional questions that helped me articulate feelings I'd been struggling to express. He understood family dynamics from his own experience growing up in a military family where career paths were similarly traditional and hierarchical. But he also brought an outside perspective that helped me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. As Morrison Design Studios continued to grow and evolve, I found myself caring less about my family's approval and more about the work itself. The projects we were taking on were increasingly sophisticated and impactful. We were helping companies solve complex problems, creating digital experiences that improved people's lives, and building a team of talented professionals who were passionate about their work. The success felt sustainable and meaningful in ways that transcended external validation. When a nonprofit client told us that our website redesign had doubled their volunteer recruitment, that mattered more than any family dinner conversation. When a startup credited our user experience work with helping them secure their Series A funding, that felt like real impact. Yet there remained a small part of me that wished my family could see and understand what I'd built. Not for validation, exactly, but for connection. I wanted to share the excitement of solving a particularly challenging design problem or the satisfaction of helping a client achieve their goals. I wanted them to understand that what I did was both creative and analytical, both artistic and strategic. This tension came to a head during the planning for our annual holiday dinner. My mother had decided to host this year, and she'd invited some extended family members who were visiting from out of state. The guest list included my Aunt Sarah and Uncle Robert along with their son Daniel, who was finishing medical school. Also attending were family friends the Johnsons, whose daughter had recently graduated law school and started at a prestigious firm downtown. As my mother described the dinner plans over the phone, I could hear the pride in her voice as she talked about Daniel's upcoming residency and Sarah Johnson's new position. When she mentioned that I should bring James if I wanted to, it felt like an afterthought. Your business friend, she called him as if she couldn't quite remember his role or significance. I almost declined the invitation. Family dinners had become predictably frustrating, and adding extended family and friends would likely amplify the dynamics that already made me feel invisible. But something made me reconsider. Maybe it was curiosity about how James would handle the situation. Or perhaps I was hoping that a larger audience might somehow shift the conversation in a more inclusive direction. When I mentioned the dinner to James during one of our weekly business planning meetings, his response surprised me. Rather than politely declining or expressing concern about family drama, he seemed genuinely interested in attending. He asked thoughtful questions about who would be there and what the typical conversation topics were. His curiosity felt different from mere politeness. James had been working on something that he'd been keeping relatively quiet, even from me. Over the past few months, I'd noticed him taking calls that he'd step out of the office for, and he'd mentioned a few meetings that seemed separate from our regular client work. When I'd asked about it, he'd said he was exploring some strategic opportunities for the company but wasn't ready to discuss details yet. As the dinner date approached, James seemed increasingly thoughtful about the event. He asked me more specific questions about my family members' backgrounds and interests. He wanted to understand their perspectives and what they valued professionally. These weren't casual questions, they felt like the kind of strategic preparation he did before important client meetings. The night before the dinner, James stayed late at the office working on something he described as presentation materials. When I asked if this was for a client project, he gave me one of his enigmatic smiles and said it was for tomorrow's dinner. I assumed he was being overly prepared for casual family conversation, which seemed very much in character for someone with his corporate background. What I didn't realize was that James had been working on something that would completely change how my family viewed both me and Morrison Design Studio. He'd been preparing for this dinner with the same strategic thinking he brought to major business presentations, and he had information that would shift the entire dynamic of our family relationship. As I got ready for the dinner that evening, I felt the familiar mixture of resignation and hope that accompanied these family gatherings. I chose my outfit carefully, selecting something that looked professional but not overly formal. James picked me up at my apartment, looking polished in a way that suggested he was taking this dinner more seriously than I'd expected. During the drive to my parents' house, James seemed unusually quiet. When I asked if he was nervous about meeting extended family, he assured me he was fine but that he had something important to share during dinner. The way he said it made me curious, but before I could ask for details, we were pulling into my parents' driveway. The Morrison family home sat on a quiet suburban street, lined with mature oak trees and well-maintained lawns. It was a comfortable two-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, the kind of house that spoke of stability and conventional success. My parents had lived there for 35 years, raising 3 children and building the kind of life that represented their values perfectly. As we walked to the front door, I could hear voices and laughter from inside. The dinner party was already in full swing, which meant I'd have to navigate introductions and catch up on conversations that had started without me. James squeezed my hand reassuringly as I rang the doorbell, a gesture that reminded me how much his support had meant during the challenging early years of building my business. My mother answered the door with her usual warm smile, greeting us both and taking our coat. She led us toward the dining room, chattering about the menu and asking James polite questions about his drive across town. The house smelled like roast beef and my mother's famous dinner rolls, familiar scents that brought back decades of family memory. The dining room was filled with the people who had shaped my understanding of success and family expectations. My father stood by the bar cart, mixing drinks and discussing sports with Uncle Robert. Marcus and Jennifer sat on the sofa sharing news about their latest home improvement project. Emma and Tom occupied the window seat, showing photos from their recent engagement party to Aunt Sarah and the Johnsons. As we entered the room, conversation paused momentarily for introductions and greeting. Everyone was polite and welcoming to James, though I noticed the familiar pattern of questions that revealed their assumptions about his role in my life. Was he a colleague? A client? Someone I was dating? The concept that he might be an equal business partner seemed to escape consideration. Daniel, my cousin finishing medical school, dominated much of the early conversation with stories about his hospital rotations and plans for his residency. The family hung on his every word, asking detailed questions about different medical specialties and expressing appropriate awe at his knowledge and dedication. Sarah Johnson, the recent law school graduate, received similar attention as she described her work at the downtown firm and her impressions of legal practice. As we moved to the dinner table, I found myself seated between Aunt Sarah and Tom, Emma's fiancé. James was positioned across from me, next to Jennifer and Daniel. The seating arrangement felt strategic, placing the successful family members and guests where they could lead conversation while relegating me to a more peripheral position. The dinner proceeded with its usual rhythm of updates, achievements, and future plans. Marcus announced that his accounting firm was promoting him to senior manager, a development that generated enthusiastic congratulations and detailed questions about his new responsibility. Emma shared news about being selected to mentor a student teacher, an honor that my parents clearly viewed with pride. When attention briefly turned to me, the questions were polite but superficial. How was my little business doing? Was I still working with computers? The tone suggested genuine interest but fundamental misunderstanding. When I tried to explain that we'd recently completed a digital transformation project for a national healthcare company, the conversation quickly shifted to Daniel's experiences in hospital information systems. James listened to these exchanges with the focused attention I'd seen him bring to client meetings. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated his understanding of each family member's work and interest. When Daniel discussed the challenges of medical record systems, James asked about user interface design and workflow optimization. When Sarah Johnson described her legal research process, he inquired about information architecture and search functionality. These questions revealed James's sophisticated understanding of how digital design and user experience principles applied across different industries. But more importantly, they showed him making connections between what my family members did and the work that Morrison Design Studios specialized in. He was building bridges that I'd never thought to construct. As the main course was served, my father asked James about his background and how he'd come to work with me. This was the opening James had been waiting for, and his response was masterfully calculated. He began by acknowledging his corporate experience and explaining how he'd specialized in helping companies scale their operations and develop strategic partnerships. Then he started talking about Morrison Design Studios in ways that I'd never heard before. He described our work not as creative services or technical implementation, but as strategic business solutions that drove measurable results for clients. He talked about return on investment, market differentiation, and competitive. He spoke the language that my family understood and respected, but James was just getting started. As dessert was being served and the conversation became more relaxed, he asked my mother if he could share something that he thought the family would find interesting. The request felt formal enough to capture everyone's attention, and suddenly all eyes were on him. What happened next would change how my family saw me forever, though I had no idea what James was about to reveal. As he reached for a folder he'd brought with him, his expression carried the confidence of someone who was about to deliver information that would reshape everything. My family thought they knew about my career and our business. The room fell quiet as James opened the folder, and I realized that whatever he was about to share would mark a turning point in my relationship with my family. The dismissive comments and polite disinterest that had characterized their view of my work were about to be challenged in ways I couldn't have imagined. As James began to speak, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Unsure what information he'd been keeping from me, but certain that it was significant enough to change everything. James cleared his throat and smiled at my mother with the kind of professional warmth I'd seen him use in boardroom presentations. "Mrs. Morrison, I think your family might be interested to know about some recent developments with Rachel's company that she's been too modest to mention herself." My heart started racing. What developments? I racked my brain trying to think of what James could possibly be referring to. We'd had several successful projects recently, but nothing that seemed earth-shattering enough to warrant this kind of formal presentation to my family. "Oh, how lovely," my mother replied, though her tone suggested she was preparing to listen politely to something she wouldn't fully understand. "Rachel does work so hard on her computer projects." James opened the folder he'd brought and pulled out what looked like official document. The paper quality was thick and expensive, the kind used for important contracts or legal agreements. My stomach tightened as I realized that whatever this was, it was significant enough to warrant professional documentation. "Well, it's quite a bit more than computer projects at this point," James said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who was about to deliver game-changing news. "Last month, Morrison Design Studios was acquired by Meridian Technology Group for $42 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My father's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. Marcus's fork clinked against his dessert plate as his hand went slap. Emma's mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. But I was experiencing my own shock. "Acquired? $42 million? I stared at James, my mind racing to process what he'd just said. This was impossible. I would have known if our company had been acquired. I was the founder and primary owner. No acquisition could happen without my knowledge and consent. James caught my confused expression and gave me a slight nod that somehow conveyed both reassurance and a request for patience. He turned back to my family, who were still sitting in stunned silence. "I'm sorry," my father finally managed. "Did you say 42 million? "That's correct," James replied, pulling out another document. "The acquisition was completed 3 weeks ago. Rachel is now the creative director and principal designer for Meridian's new digital innovation division, while I've been appointed as the division's managing director." Uncle Robert leaned forward, his business background making him the first to recover from the shock. "Meridian Technology Group. That's the company that handles digital infrastructure for half the Fortune 500, isn't it?" "Among other things, yes," James confirmed. "They've been looking to expand their capabilities in user experience design and digital transformation consulting. Morrison Design Studios had exactly the expertise and client relationships they needed." I was still trying to process this information when Aunt Sarah spoke up. "But how is that possible? Rachel, didn't you just have a small office downtown?" This was the moment I began to understand what James had been working on during those mysterious meetings and phone calls. The strategic opportunities he'd mentioned weren't potential future partnerships. They were active negotiations for something I hadn't even known was on the table. James smiled at my aunt with the patience of someone who was enjoying the reaction he was getting. "The office downtown was actually just our primary location. Morrison Design Studios has been operating remotely with clients across North America for the past 2 years. Our team includes 37 full-time employees and contractors working on projects for companies you'd definitely recognize." 37 employees? I mentally counted the people I knew were working with us, and came up with maybe 15, including part-time contractors. Either James was inflating numbers or there were aspects of our business operations that I wasn't fully aware of. Daniel, my cousin the medical student, was the first to ask the obvious question. "Rachel, Is this true? Did you really sell your company for $42 million? All eyes turned to me, and I found myself in the surreal position of not knowing how to answer. James was presenting information about my own company that I didn't recognize, yet he was doing it with such confidence and documentation that it felt real. More importantly, he was doing it in a way that was completely transforming how my family saw me. I started, then stopped. James caught my eye and gave me another of those meaningful looks. There was something in his expression that asked me to trust him, to go along with whatever he was orchestrating. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. It's been a complicated process. Complicated is an understatement, James said with a chuckle that suggested intimate knowledge of business negotiations. Rachel has been incredibly strategic about maintaining operational control while leveraging Meridian's resources and client base. It's actually quite brilliant from a business development perspective. My mother looked like she was trying to solve a complex mathematical equation in her head. But Rachel, why didn't you tell us about any of this? James answered before I could fumble through an explanation. Part of the acquisition agreement included confidentiality clauses during the negotiation period. Rachel literally couldn't discuss it until the deal was finalized and announced publicly. He pulled out another document, this one looking official enough to be a press release. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to read the announcement that went out to industry publications yesterday. My family nodded eagerly, suddenly hanging on every word James spoke. The transformation in their attention level was remarkable. These were the same people who had spent years glazing over when I tried to explain my work, and now they were leaning forward with the kind of focused interest usually reserved for Marcus's promotion announcement. James began reading from what appeared to be a professionally written press release. Meridian Technology Group is pleased to announce the acquisition of Morrison Design Studios, a leading digital experience consultancy known for innovative user interface design and strategic digital transformation solutions. The acquisition strengthens Meridian's position in the rapidly growing market for enterprise digital experiences. He looked up from the document. It goes on to list some of our major clients. Companies like Hartwell Medical Systems, which Daniel might know from his hospital rotation. They're one of the largest medical device manufacturers in the country, and we redesigned their entire customer portal system last year. Daniel's eyes widened. Hartwell, I've used their systems during my rotations. The interface is incredibly intuitive. That was Rachel's design, James said with obvious pride. She led a team that completely reimagined how medical professionals interact with equipment ordering and maintenance systems. The project reduced training time for new users by 60%. And increased system efficiency by almost 40%. I was beginning to understand what James was doing, and it was both brilliant and terrifying. He was taking real projects we'd worked on and framing them in ways that highlighted their scope and impact. The Hartwell project had indeed been significant, but James was describing it with the kind of detail and context that made its importance undeniable. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, spoke up for the first time during the conversation. I had no idea that kind of design work was so strategic. I always thought websites were just about making things look pretty. That's a common misconception, James replied. What Rachel does is solve complex problems about human behavior and psychology. When someone interacts with a digital system, how do they think? What do they expect to happen? How can we design experiences that feel intuitive and efficient? He turned to Mark. Actually, your accounting firm could probably benefit from this kind of thinking. How many hours do your clients spend struggling with your online document submission system? Marcus looked uncomfortable. Well, we do get complaints about the client portal being confused. Exactly the kind of problem Rachel specializes in solving, James said. Poor user experience design cost businesses millions of dollars in lost productivity and customer satisfaction. What Rachel does is quantify these problems and create solutions that have measurable business impact. Sarah Johnson, the recent law school graduate, raised her hand tentatively. Can I ask about the financial side? $42 million Seems like an enormous amount for a design company. James smiled like he'd been hoping someone would ask that question. The valuation was actually based on recurring revenue and projected growth. Morrison Design Studios was generating approximately $8 million in annual revenue with profit margins of around 30%. But more importantly, we had contracts and relationships that Meridian valued at significantly more than our current revenue. $8 million in annual revenue. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but internally I was questioning everything I thought I knew about our business finance. Our quarterly numbers had been strong, but I'd never calculated annual projections that approached $8 million. My father, who had been unusually quiet during this conversation, finally spoke up. James, forgive me for being direct, but this all sounds almost too good to be true. Are you saying that Rachel's little design business was worth more than most people's houses? Multiple houses, actually. James replied without missing a beat, and I understand your skepticism. It's difficult to grasp how valuable these skills have become in our economy. But consider this. Every company you interact with daily has spent significant money on user experience design. Your banking app, your favorite restaurant's ordering system, the website where you book travel. Behind each of these experiences is someone doing exactly what Rachel does. He pulled out his phone and opened what appeared to be a financial app. Rachel, would you mind if I showed them the portfolio overview? I had no idea what portfolio he was referring to, but I nodded, feeling like I was caught in a current I couldn't control. James turned his phone screen toward my family, displaying what looked like a sophisticated investment dashboard. This shows Rachel's post-acquisition equity position and projected earnings, he explained. Between her ownership stake in the new division, performance bonuses tied to growth targets, and stock options in Meridian, her total compensation package is approximately $2.7 million annually. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. $2.7 million annual. I did quick mental math and realized that was more than my father had earned in his entire career. It was more than Marcus would make in decades as an accountant. It was more money than anyone in my family had ever imagined having. Emma was the first to break the silence. Rachel, are you actually making almost $3 million a year? James answered for me again, and I was grateful because I genuinely didn't know what to say. That's the projected total compensation. Yes, though much of it is tied to performance metrics and long-term equity growth. Rachel isn't just collecting a salary. She's building wealth through ownership and strategic decision-making. Tom, Emma's fiancé, shook his head in amazement. I'm sorry, but I have to ask, if Rachel is making that kind of money, why is she driving a Honda Civic? James laughed. And for the first time since this conversation began, his response felt completely natural and unscripted. Because Rachel is incredibly practical about money, she's been investing most of her earnings back into the business and building a diversified investment portfolio. She's not interested in flashy displays of wealth. Plus, he added with a grin, she's planning to buy a Tesla once the new model comes out next year. She's very particular about technology purchases. This detail was actually true, and hearing James mention it reminded me that underneath whatever elaborate presentation he was orchestrating, he knew me well enough to include authentic personal details that made the larger story feel credible. Uncle Robert, whose business background made him naturally skeptical of financial claims, leaned forward with a probing question. James, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what's your role in all of this? Are you Rachel's employee? Or partner? Or what exactly? James straightened in his chair, and I could see him preparing to deliver what felt like the climax of his presentation. I'm the managing director of Meridian's Digital Innovation Division, which means I oversee business operations while Rachel leads creative strategy. But more than that, I'm a 20% equity partner in the division, which makes my investment in Rachel's success quite literal. He paused to let that information sink in before continuing. My background is in scaling successful businesses, and I've never worked with anyone who combines creative brilliance with strategic thinking the way Rachel does. From a purely business perspective, Partnering with her has been the smartest career decision I've ever made. The way James said this felt different from the rest of his presentation. There was genuine emotion in his voice that suggested he was speaking from personal conviction rather than strategic calculation. It was the first moment in this entire conversation where I felt like I was hearing something completely true and unfiltered. Aunt Sarah, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics throughout dinner, asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the evening's tension. "Rachel, how does it feel to have achieved this kind of success when your family didn't really understand what you were building?" It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. How did it feel? I looked around the table at faces that reflected everything from amazement to confusion to what might have been shame. These were people who had spent years treating my career as a minor curiosity, and now they were learning that it was more financially successful than anything anyone in our family had ever achieved. "Honestly," I said, finding my voice for the first time since James had started his presentation, "it feels surreal. Not the success itself, but sitting here explaining it to all of you." I took a breath and decided to push further into honesty. For years I felt like I had to apologize for my choices or defend them as legitimate. Every family gathering included questions about when I was going to get a real job or settle into something more traditional. It was exhausting. My mother looked genuinely distraught. "Rachel, we never meant to make you feel that way. We were just concerned about your security and stability." "I understand that," I replied. But the assumption was always that what I was doing wasn't real work or real success, because it didn't look like what you recognize. Tonight is the first time anyone has asked detailed questions about my actual work instead of just politely acknowledging that I do something with computers. Marcus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since James's revelations began, finally spoke up. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. I've been condescending about your career for years, and it turns out you were building something I couldn't have imagined. I feel like an idiot." The admission was so honest and unexpected that it caught me off guard. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one whose achievements were automatically understood and celebrated. Hearing him acknowledge that he'd misjudged my path felt like a fundamental shift in our sibling dynamic. "You don't need to feel like an idiot," I said, "but I appreciate you saying that." Jennifer, Marcus's wife, added her own perspective. "I think we all got caught up in thinking that success only looks one way. Rachel, what you've built is incredible, and I'm sorry we didn't see it before tonight." Daniel, my medical student cousin, raised his hand like he was in class. "Can I ask a practical question, Rachel? What advice would you give to someone like me who's following a traditional career path? Should I be worried that I'm missing opportunities in technology?" It was a thoughtful question that acknowledged both the validity of his chosen path and the possibility that there might be lessons to learn from mine. James looked at me expectantly, clearly wanting me to field this one myself. "I think the key is understanding that there are multiple ways to create value and build a career," I said. "What you're doing in medicine is incredibly important and will always be needed, but you might also look for ways to incorporate innovation and problem-solving into your practice. How can technology improve patient care? What digital tools could make medical procedures more efficient?" I was warming to the topic, feeling more confident as I spoke. "The future isn't about choosing between traditional careers and technology careers. It's about bringing innovative thinking to whatever field you're in." James nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Some of our most successful projects have come from working with professionals like Daniel, who understand their industry deeply and can identify problems that technology can solve." Sarah Johnson, the new lawyer, asked a follow-up question. "Is there opportunity for someone in law to work with companies like yours?" "Absolutely," James replied. "Legal technology is a huge growth area. How lawyers research cases, how they communicate with clients, how they manage document discovery. These are all user experience problems that need solving." The conversation was shifting from shock about my success to genuine curiosity about the intersection of traditional careers and innovative thinking. For the first time in my adult life, My family was asking substantive questions about my field and considering how it connected to their own work. My father, who had been processing everything in his methodical way, asked the question I'd been wondering about myself. James, I have to ask, how long have you known about this acquisition? Because Rachel seems as surprised as the rest of us. James smiled and looked at me with what appeared to be affection mixed with professional respect. Rachel has known about the negotiations for months, but she's been incredibly disciplined about maintaining confidentiality. The final terms and timeline came together very quickly, and she's still adjusting to the new reality. This was a diplomatic way of handling my obvious confusion, and I appreciated that James was protecting me from having to explain something I genuinely didn't understand. But it also made me realize that there were significant aspects of this story that I needed clarification on once we were alone. My mother, ever focused on family relationships, asked the question that had probably been bothering her all evening. Rachel, why didn't you feel like you could share any of this with us? We're your family. It was a fair question, but also a complex one. How could I explain years of feeling dismissed and misunderstood? How could I articulate the frustration of having my achievements minimized or ignored? How could I convey the exhaustion of constantly having to justify my choices to people who seemed fundamentally uninterested in understanding them? Mom, I said carefully, it's hard to share exciting news with people who have consistently treated what you do as less important or less real than other kinds of work. When someone asks how your little computer business is going, it doesn't feel like they're prepared to hear about complex negotiations or major acquisitions. The truth of this statement was evident in the uncomfortable shifting around the table. My family was recognizing their own behavior in my description, and it clearly wasn't pleasant. Emma, always the peacemaker, tried to bridge the gap. We want to understand better going forward. Could you help us learn more about what you actually do? I'd like that, I said, meaning, but it would require genuine curiosity, not just polite questions. The work is complex and strategic, and it takes time to explain properly. James jumped in with a suggestion that surprised me. Actually, Rachel has been invited to speak at the Digital Innovation Summit next month. It's a major industry conference where she'll be presenting case studies of successful digital transformations. The whole family would be welcome to attend if you're interested in seeing her in action. This was news to me, but I was beginning to understand that James had been orchestrating opportunities and arrangements that I wasn't fully aware of. The idea of my family attending a professional conference where I was speaking felt both thrilling and terrifying. We'd love to come, my father said immediately. I think it's time we understood what our daughter actually does for a living. The statement was simple, but it represented a fundamental acknowledgement that they had never really understood my work. It was an admission that felt like the beginning of a different kind of relationship. As the evening wound down and people began clearing dessert plates and gathering their belongings, the energy in the room felt completely different from when we'd arrived. Instead of polite small talk and familiar family patterns, there were animated conversations about technology, innovation, and business strategy. Daniel cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping my mother load the dishwasher. Rachel, can I ask you something personal? Do you ever feel like you've missed out on having a more traditional life? Marriage? Kids? The whole suburban thing? It was a perceptive question from someone who was himself following a very traditional professional path. Sometimes, I admit, but I also think there are different ways to build a meaningful life. I love the work I do, I love the people I work with, and I love the problems we solve. That feels pretty fulfilling. Fair enough, Daniel said. I guess I'm realizing that success can look very different from what I've been taught to expect. As James and I prepared to leave, my parents walked us to the door. The conversation felt different from any family farewell I could remember. Instead of vague promises to call soon or generic expressions of love, there were specific requests for information and genuine expressions of pride. Rachel, my father said as we reached the front door, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand how significant it really is. The apology was unexpected and deeply meaningful. My father had never been someone who admitted mistakes easily, and hearing him acknowledge his misjudgment felt like a gift. "Thank you, Dad," I said, surprised by how emotional the moment felt. "That means more than you know." As we drove away from my parents' house, I finally turned to James with all the questions I'd been holding back during dinner. "Okay, what the hell was that?" "Acquisition. $42 million? Annual compensation of $2.7 million? Are we living in the same reality?" James was quiet for a moment, navigating through the residential streets before responding. When he finally spoke, his tone was completely different from the confident presentation voice he'd used all evening. "Rachel," he said carefully, "how much attention have you been paying to our financial growth over the past year?" It was a fair question. I'd been so focused on the creative work and client relationships that I'd largely left financial management and business development to James. I reviewed quarterly summaries and approved major expenditures, but I hadn't been tracking day-to-day revenue or analyzing growth trends. "Not enough, apparently," I admitted. "Are you telling me we actually were acquired by Meridian Technology Group?" "We're in final negotiations," James said. "And yes, the preliminary valuation is in the range I mentioned. I've been working on this for 8 months, but I wanted to wait until I had solid terms before bringing it to you." I stared at him, processing this information. 8 months? James, this is my company. How can you negotiate an acquisition without involving me? "Because I knew you'd panic and potentially sabotage something that's incredibly good for both of us," he said with uncomfortable honesty. "You're brilliant at design and strategy, but you're terrible at recognizing your own value. If I'd told you that Meridian was interested, you would have found reasons why it wouldn't work." He was probably right, which made his unilateral decision-making even more frustrating. "So what exactly is true and what was performance art for my family?" James pulled into a parking lot so we could have this conversation without the distraction of driving. "The acquisition offer is real, the valuation is accurate, the revenue numbers are based on projected growth with Meridian's resources and client base. The compensation package is what they've offered you as creative director. And the 37 employees? We currently have 18 full-time people and 19 contractors. But with the Meridian deal, we'd be absorbing their existing design team and expanding significantly." I rubbed my temples, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was describing. "James, this is enormous. Why didn't you trust me enough to include me in these conversations?" "Because," he said, turning to face me directly, "you've spent so many years being told that what you do isn't valuable or important, that you've internalized some of that doubt. When I present our work to potential partners, I see it clearly. When you talk about our work, you minimize it." The observation stung because it felt accurate. I had developed habits of downplaying my achievements, partly as a defense against family criticism, and partly because I genuinely struggled to see my work the way outsiders did. So tonight was what exactly? A demonstration of how I should present myself? "Tonight was your family finally seeing you the way the business world sees you," James said. "As someone who's built something remarkable and valuable. As someone whose work has real impact and significance." I thought about the expressions around the dinner table when James was explaining our projects and achievements. The attention, the respect, the genuine curiosity about my work. It was everything I'd wanted from my family for years, but achieved through a presentation that felt partially fabricated. "But it was based on an acquisition I haven't agreed to," I pointed out. "True," James acknowledged, "but Rachel, you should agree to it. This is an incredible opportunity. Meridian has resources and connections that would let us work on projects we could never access independently. The financial terms are extraordinary, and most importantly, it validates everything you've built." As we sat in the parking lot discussing the biggest decision of my professional life, I realized that James had orchestrated this evening to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. He'd wanted to change my family's perception of my success, demonstrate the value of our partnership, and create momentum for a business decision he believed was in my best interest. It was manipulative, but it was also effective. For the first time in my adult life, My family had treated me as someone whose professional achievements were worthy of attention and respect. They had asked thoughtful questions about my work and expressed genuine pride in my success. "What happens if I say no to the acquisition?" I asked. "Then we continue growing Morrison Design Studios independently," James replied. "But we'll be leaving significant opportunities on the table, and honestly, I think you'll always wonder what could have been." The weight of the decision felt enormous, but underneath my confusion and frustration, I could feel something else. Excitement, the projects James was describing, the resources Meridian could provide, the opportunity to work at a scale I'd never imagined. These were compelling possibilities. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course," James agreed. "But Rachel, I want you to consider something. Tonight your family saw you as successful, accomplished and valuable. That wasn't because of my presentation skills or the numbers I shared. That was because you genuinely are all of those things. The acquisition doesn't create your value, it recognizes value that already exists." As we drove the rest of the way to my apartment, I reflected on the evening's revelations and their implications. My family's perception of me had changed dramatically, but more importantly, I was beginning to see my own work and achievements differently. The question now was whether I was ready to embrace the kind of success and opportunity that James was presenting, even if it meant stepping into a much larger and more visible professional role than I'd ever imagined for myself. The morning after the dinner party, I woke up feeling like I'd been living someone else's life for the past 12 hours. My phone was buzzing incessantly with text messages from family members, each one reflecting their continued amazement about the previous evening's revelation. Emma had sent 3 separate messages asking for business advice about the elementary school's website redesign project. Marcus wanted to schedule lunch to discuss how user experience principles might apply to his accounting firm's client portal. Even my mother had texted asking if I could help her understand why her favorite shopping website was so difficult to navigate. The attention was gratifying in ways I hadn't expected, but it also felt surreal. These were the same people who had spent years treating my work as a minor hobby, and suddenly they were reaching out for professional guidance and expertise. The shift was so dramatic that it highlighted just how profound their previous dismissal had been. James had scheduled a meeting for 10 o'clock to discuss the Meridian acquisition in detail. I spent the morning reviewing every document I could find related to our company's finances, trying to understand how we had grown to the point where an 8-figure acquisition was even possible. The numbers were all there in quarterly reports and client contracts, but somehow I had never connected them into the larger picture that James had presented to my family. When I arrived at our office, James was already in the conference room with what appeared to be a small mountain of documents spread across the table. Legal contracts, financial projections, competitive analyses, and what looked like organizational charts for a much larger company than I thought we were running. "Good morning," he said, looking up from a particularly thick stack of papers. "How are you feeling about everything?" "Confused, impressed, and slightly betrayed," I replied honestly, but mostly confused. "How did you manage to negotiate a $42 million acquisition for a company that I thought was worth maybe $5 million on a good day?" James gestured for me to sit down and pushed a folder toward me. "This contains everything you need to understand how we got here, but the short answer is that you've been dramatically undervaluing what we've built." I opened the folder and found a comprehensive business analysis that looked like something a consulting firm would charge 6 figures to produce. It detailed our client retention rates, project profit margins, recurring revenue streams, and competitive positioning in ways that I had never considered. According to this analysis, Morrison Design Studios wasn't just a successful small business, it was a strategically positioned company in a rapidly growing market. "Rachel," James said, settling into the chair across from me, "you've been thinking about our work as individual projects for individual clients, but what we've actually built is a systematic approach to solving digital experience problems that can be scaled and replicated across industry." He pulled out a chart showing our client growth over the past 3 years. The trajectory was steeper than I had realized, with revenue increasing by an average of 40% annually. More importantly, our client retention rate was over 90%, which meant that companies who worked with us continued to hire us for additional projects. Meridian isn't just buying our current revenue, James explained. They're buying our methodology, our client relationships, and our ability to generate consistent results in a market that most companies are struggling to understand. I studied the financial projections, trying to reconcile them with my day-to-day experience of running the business. The numbers were impressive, but they also represented a level of strategic thinking that I hadn't been applying to our growth. How long have you been thinking about this acquisition? I asked. Honestly? About 18 months, James replied. But I started actively pursuing it 8 months ago when Meridian reached out through a mutual contact. 8 months of negotiations that I had been completely unaware of. I wasn't sure whether to be angry about being excluded or impressed by James's strategic planning. Probably both. Why didn't you involve me from the beginning? James was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because I know you, Rachel. You would have found reasons why it wouldn't work. You would have focused on potential problems instead of opportunity. You would have convinced yourself that we weren't ready, or that they weren't serious. The assessment was uncomfortable because it felt accurate. I did tend to focus on obstacles and challenges rather than possibility. It was a mindset that had served me well when building a business from scratch, but it might have been limiting as we reached a point where bigger opportunities were available. So what exactly are the terms? I asked, deciding to focus on practical details rather than philosophical questions about decision-making processes. James pulled out a clean copy of the acquisition agreement. Meridian is offering $42 million for 100% of Morrison Design Studio, but rather than a simple buyout, they're structuring it as an integration where we become their digital innovation division. He walked me through the organizational structure. I would serve as creative director with complete authority over design strategy and methodology. James would be managing director, overseeing business operations and client relationships. Our existing team would be retained and expanded, with opportunities for advancement within Meridian's larger structure. The financial package is designed to keep us invested in long-term success, James continued. $25 million paid at closing, with the remaining $17 million tied to performance milestones over 3 years, plus equity positions in the new division and stock options in Meridian. I calculated the numbers quickly. Even the conservative scenario would make me financially secure for life. The optimistic projections were almost incomprehensible in terms of personal wealth. And if we don't meet the performance milestone, then we still walk away with $25 million and executive positions at a Fortune 500 company, James pointed out. Rachel, there's essentially no downside to this deal. As I reviewed the contract details, I began to understand why James had been so confident in his presentation to my family. This wasn't speculative or optimistic. It was a formal offer with specific terms and timeline. The acquisition was real, substantial, and imminent, pending my approval. What about our existing clients? What happens to the relationships we've built? They transfer to the new division, but with enhanced capabilities, James explained. Meridian has resources we could never provide independent. Larger project teams, specialized expertise, integration with other technology services. Our clients will actually benefit from the acquisition. He showed me letters of intent from several major clients, expressing enthusiasm about the expanded capabilities that the Meridian partnership would provide. Companies that had been working with us on individual projects were interested in comprehensive digital transformation initiatives that would require exactly the kind of resources that Meridian could offer. There's something else, James said, pulling out another document. Meridian wants us to lead their expansion into the healthcare technology market. They've identified it as a major growth opportunity, and our work with medical device companies gives us credibility in that space. Healthcare technology was indeed a rapidly expanding field, driven by regulatory changes and increasing demand for efficient digital systems. If we could establish ourselves as leaders in that market, the growth potential was enormous. How much time do I have to decide? I asked. The formal deadline is next Friday, James replied, but realistically they need an answer by Wednesday to meet their quarterly announcement timeline. 5 days to make the biggest decision of my professional life. It felt like an impossibly short timeframe for something so significant, but I also recognized that extended deliberation might not provide additional clarity. My phone rang with a call from my mother interrupting our contract review. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity about her post-dinner perspective made me answer. "Rachel, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of deference. "Just reviewing some business documents with James," I replied. "What's up, Mom?" "Well, your father and I have been talking about last night, and we realize we owe you a much bigger apology than we gave you. We've been thoughtless about your career for years, and learning about your success made us recognize how dismissive we've been." The admission was unexpected and more comprehensive than her comments the previous evening. "Mom, I appreciate that. It has been frustrating to feel like my work wasn't taken seriously. We want to make that right going forward," she continued. "Your father is telling everyone at his golf club about your acquisition. He's so proud he can barely contain himself." I caught James's eye and saw him smiling at my mother's enthusiasm. The idea of my traditionally reserved father bragging about my business success to his golf buddies was both touching and amusing. "That's really sweet, Mom, but I should mention that the acquisition isn't completely finalized yet. There are still some details to work out." "Oh, of course," she replied quickly. "We don't want to say anything that might complicate your negotiations. But Rachel, we're just so impressed by what you've built, and James seems like such a wonderful partner. You're lucky to have someone who understands your vision so well." After ending the call, I realized that my family's reaction to the previous evening's revelations was providing additional perspective on the acquisition decision. For years I had craved recognition and understanding from people whose opinions mattered to me. Now that I had it, I was beginning to see my achievements more clearly. "James," I said, looking up from the contract documents, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What do you get out of this partnership?" "I mean, with your background, you could probably negotiate a senior position at any number of companies. Why tie your career to mine?" James leaned back in his chair considering the question. "Because working with you is the most intellectually stimulating and professionally satisfying. You solve problems in ways that no one else thinks of. You see possibilities that others miss, and you care about the impact of your work in ways that make everything we do more meaningful." He paused, then continued with obvious sincerity. "But also because I think you're capable of much bigger things than you realize. This acquisition isn't the end goal, it's a platform for building something even more significant." "Like what?" "Like becoming the definitive expert in digital experience design, like writing the methodologies that other companies will follow, like speaking at conferences, consulting for major corporations, maybe even starting a foundation that brings design thinking to nonprofit organizations." The vision James was describing felt both exciting and intimidating. I had always focused on individual projects and immediate challenges, rather than long-term professional legacy. The idea of positioning myself as a thought leader, or industry expert, required a level of confidence and visibility that felt uncomfortable. "That sounds like a lot of pressure," I admitted. "Only if you think about it as pressure," James replied, "but it could also be freedom. Freedom to work on the projects you find most interesting, with the resources to do them exceptionally well. Freedom to turn down work that doesn't align with your values. Freedom to build exactly the kind of career you want instead of just responding to whatever opportunities come your way." I spent the rest of the morning reviewing financial projections and competitive analyses, while James handled client calls and operational issues. The office felt different knowing that it might soon be absorbed into a much larger organization. Every conversation and decision carried weight as potential precedents for how we would operate in the new structure. Around noon, I received a text from Marcus asking if he could stop by the office during his lunch break. He had never visited our workspace before, despite working only a few blocks away. His request felt like another example of how dramatically the previous evening had shifted family dynamics. When Marcus arrived, I could see him taking in the office environment with new eyes. The collaborative workspace, the multiple monitors and design equipment, the wall displaying client logos and project awards. He spent several minutes examining our work samples, asking detailed questions about specific projects and their business impact. "Rachel, I owe you a much bigger apology than I gave you last night," he said, as we sat in my office. "I've been condescending about your career for years, and I'm just now realizing how successful you actually are." "Marcus, you don't need to apologize. I understand why it was hard to understand what I was doing." "No, that's not good enough," he insisted. "I could have asked better questions. I could have made an effort to learn about your work instead of just assuming it was less important than what I was doing." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus asking thoughtful questions about business strategy, client development, and industry trends. For the first time in our adult relationship, we were talking as professional peers, rather than as the successful sibling in the family disappointment. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, as he prepared to leave. "Last night, James mentioned that you might be able to help companies like my accounting firm improve their client experience. Were you just being polite, or is that something you'd actually be interested in?" The question surprised me because it suggested that Marcus was thinking seriously about applying design principles to his own work. "I'd be very interested," I replied. "There are probably efficiency improvements and client satisfaction improvements that could make a real difference in your practice. Would you be willing to do a consultation?" Obviously, I'd pay your normal rate. The offer to pay my normal rates was touching because it represented Marcus treating me as a legitimate professional, rather than as his little sister doing him a favor. "Let's schedule something after I get through this acquisition decision," I suggested. "But yes, I'd love to help." That afternoon, I met with our senior team members to discuss the potential acquisition and get their perspectives on how it might affect their roles and career development. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with several people expressing excitement about the opportunity to work on larger projects with more extensive resources. Sarah, our lead user experience researcher, was particularly enthusiastic about the healthcare technology focus that James had mentioned. "I've been wanting to get more involved in medical device design." The opportunity to improve systems that directly impact patient care feels incredibly meaningful." Tom, our senior developer, was interested in the technical infrastructure that Meridian could provide. "We've been limited by hosting costs and processing power on some of our larger projects," he explained. "Having enterprise-level resources would let us build much more sophisticated solutions." The team's positive response helped clarify my own thinking about the acquisition. These were talented professionals whose careers would benefit from the expanded opportunities that Meridian could provide. My decision wasn't just about my own financial future, it was about creating better career paths for people I cared about. That evening, I drove to a quiet coffee shop across town to think through the decision without the distractions of office conversations and family phone calls. I spread the acquisition documents across a corner table and tried to evaluate the opportunity objectively. The financial terms were undeniably attractive. Even conservative projections would provide financial security beyond anything I had imagined when starting Morrison Design Studios. The integration structure preserved operational autonomy while providing resources for growth. The timeline was aggressive but manageable. More importantly, the acquisition represented validation of everything I had been working toward. A Fortune 500 company had evaluated my business methods and client relationships, and determined that they were worth tens of millions of dollars. That kind of external validation felt significant after years of family skepticism and self-doubt. But the decision also involved giving up the independence and control that had been central to my identity as an entrepreneur. Morrison Design Studios would become the digital innovation division of Meridian Technology Group. I would report to executives I had never met, within a corporate structure I didn't fully understand. As I sat in the coffee shop weighing these considerations, I realized that James had been right about one thing. I was focusing on potential problems rather than opportunity. The challenges of integration and corporate politics were real, but they were also manageable with the right approach and preparation. My phone buzzed with a text from James asking how my thinking was progressing. Instead of responding immediately, I called him and asked if he could meet me at the coffee shop for a final discussion about the decision. When James arrived 20 minutes later, he found me surrounded by contract documents and financial projections, looking like someone trying to solve a complex equation. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Overwhelmed but optimistic," I replied. I think I want to move forward with the acquisition, but I need some reassurance about a few things. Such as whether you're confident that we can maintain our company culture and work quality within a larger corporate structure, such as whether the healthcare technology focus aligns with projects we'd actually want to work on, such as whether this partnership will strengthen our relationship or create new tension. James addressed each concern systematically, drawing on his corporate experience to explain how successful integrations typically worked. He showed me examples of other companies that had maintained their identity and culture after being acquired by larger organizations. He outlined specific healthcare technology projects that aligned perfectly with our expertise and interest. As for our partnership, he said, I think this acquisition will actually strengthen our working relationship, because it eliminates the financial pressure and uncertainty that comes with running an independent business. We'll be able to focus entirely on doing excellent work instead of worrying about cash flow and business development. By the time we finished our coffee shop discussion, I had reached a decision. The opportunity was too significant to pass up, and my concerns were manageable with proper planning and communication. Let's do it, I said, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness about what we were committing to. James smiled with obvious relief and satisfaction. I think this is the right decision, Rachel, and I think you're going to be amazed by what we can accomplish with Meridian's resource. As we gathered up the contract documents and prepared to leave, I realized that accepting the acquisition meant stepping into a completely different professional identity. I would go from being the founder of a small design studio to being the creative director of a major technology division. The transition would require confidence and strategic thinking that I was still developing, but I was also beginning to understand that growth often requires accepting opportunities that feel bigger than your current capability. The previous evening's dinner conversation had shown me how differently others perceived my achievements compared to how I saw them myself. Maybe it was time to start seeing my career through a more confident and expansive lens. The decision to accept the Meridian acquisition felt like crossing a threshold into a future that was both uncertain and full of possibility. It represented not just financial success, but professional validation, and the opportunity to build something larger than anything I had previously imagined. As James and I drove back toward downtown, I felt a sense of anticipation about calling my family to share the news that the acquisition was moving forward. For the first time in my adult life, I had professional news that I was genuinely excited to share with them, knowing that they would understand its significance and celebrate my success. 6 months after signing with Meridian, I stood in the lobby of the convention center waiting for my family to arrive for my keynote presentation at the Digital Innovation Summit. The transformation in both my career and family relationships had been more dramatic than I could have anticipated when James first revealed the acquisition at that holiday dinner. The Morrison family arrived together, looking slightly out of place among the tech industry professionals, but clearly excited to be there. My mother had researched the conference beforehand and kept mentioning how impressed she was that I was the opening speaker. My father wore a suit I'd never seen before and carried a leather portfolio where he was keeping copies of my presentation materials to show his golf friends. Marcus brought Jennifer along with several colleagues from his accounting firm who were interested in learning about digital transformation strategies for professional services. Emma had convinced Tom to take the day off so they could attend together. Even Daniel had driven down from medical school, curious about healthcare technology application. James met us at the registration desk, looking every inch the corporate executive in his tailored suit and conference badge, identifying him as managing director of Meridian's Digital Innovation Division. The ease with which he had transitioned into the corporate environment continued to impress me. How are you feeling about the presentation? James asked as we walked toward the main auditorium. Nervous but ready, I replied honestly. Speaking to 800 industry professionals felt like a completely different challenge from the client presentations I was accustomed to giving. Remember, James said with a supportive smile, you're not just Rachel Morrison anymore. You're the creative director who led the team that redesigned patient care systems for 3 major hospital networks. You're the expert who increased user satisfaction by an average of 47% across 12 digital transformation projects. The reminder helped center my confidence. Over the past 6 months, Working within Meridian's structure had given me access to projects and resources that had elevated both the scope and impact of our work. The results spoke for themselves in ways that made public speaking feel like a natural extension of the work, rather than an intimidating performance. As we entered the auditorium, I could see my family settling into the front section that had been reserved for them. My mother was taking photos of the stage setup while my father studied the program with obvious pride. Marcus was deep in conversation with one of his colleagues, gesturing toward the presentation slides that were being tested on the large screen. The conference organizer approached me for a final sound check and briefing. "Miss Morrison, we're expecting this to be one of our most well-attended keynotes. There's significant interest in how traditional companies can successfully integrate innovative design thinking." The topic of my presentation was Bridging the Gap: How User Experience Design Transforms Business Operations. I had chosen to focus on real case studies from our work with medical device companies, financial services firms, and manufacturing operations. The goal was to demonstrate how design thinking could solve practical business problems rather than just create attractive interfaces. As the auditorium filled with attendees, I caught sight of several executives from companies we had worked with. Dr. Patterson from Hartwell Medical Systems was in the third row, along with the entire team that had collaborated with us on their customer portal redesign. Seeing clients who had experienced the impact of our work firsthand gave me additional confidence about the relevance of my message. James took his seat with my family just as the conference moderator began my introduction. Hearing my professional accomplishments read aloud to hundreds of industry peers felt surreal. The introduction mentioned the Meridian acquisition, our healthcare technology initiatives, and the measurable business results our design strategies had generated for clients. When I walked onto the stage, the applause felt genuinely enthusiastic rather than merely polite. I could see my family in the front section, my mother recording with her phone while my father sat forward with obvious attention. "Good morning," I began, feeling my nervousness settle into focused energy. 6 months ago, I was running a small design studio from a converted storefront downtown. Today, I'm here to talk about how user experience design can transform the way traditional businesses operate and serve their customers. The presentation unfolded smoothly, with audience engagement that exceeded my expectations. When I described the healthcare portal project that had reduced patient registration time by 60%, Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly from the audience. When I outlined the financial services interface that had increased customer satisfaction scores by 35%, several banking executives took note. The case study that generated the most interest was our work with Morrison Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that had struggled with inefficient internal communication systems. By redesigning their project management interface and streamlining information architecture, we had reduced project completion time by 22% and improved interdepartmental collaboration significantly. The key insight, I explained to the audience, is that user experience design isn't just about making things look better, it's about understanding how people actually work and removing obstacles that prevent them from being effective. During the question and answer session, the inquiries were sophisticated and demonstrated genuine interest in implementation strategies. A hospital administrator asked about change management when introducing new digital systems. A manufacturing executive wanted to understand how to measure the return on investment for design improvements. The most meaningful question came from a young woman who identified herself as a recent college graduate, starting her career in business consulting. "Morrison, what advice would you give to someone who wants to bring innovative thinking to a traditional industry?" I thought about my own journey from dismissed family member to conference keynote speaker before responding. Start by deeply understanding the problems you're trying to solve. Don't assume that innovation means throwing out everything that currently works. The best solutions build on existing strengths while addressing specific pain points. I paused, making eye contact with my family in the front section. And remember that success often looks different from what people expect. Don't let others' limited understanding of your field prevent you from pursuing work that feels meaningful and impactful. The applause at the end of my presentation was sustained and enthusiastic. Several attendees approached the stage immediately afterward with business cards and follow-up questions. Dr. Patterson introduced me to colleagues from other medical systems who were interested in similar portal redesign. As the auditorium emptied, my family gathered around me with expressions of amazement and pride that felt completely different from any family interaction I could remember. "Rachel," my father said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was extraordinary. I finally understand what you actually do, and it's so much more important than I ever realized." My mother hugged me tightly. "You were so confident and knowledgeable up there. I kept thinking about how we used to worry about your future, and look at you now." Marcus was particularly effusive in his praise. "Rachel, I'm going to be calling you next week about our firm's client portal. After hearing your presentation, I realize we're probably losing clients because our systems are so user-unfriendly." Emma and Tom had been taking notes throughout the presentation. "We want to apply some of these principles to the school district's parent communication system," Emma explained. "Would you be willing to consult on that project?" Daniel, my medical student cousin, was excited about the healthcare applications. "The hospital where I'm doing rotations has exactly the kind of inefficient registration system you described. Could I connect you with their IT director?" The enthusiastic response from my family felt like the completion of a transformation that had begun 6 months earlier. They weren't just being polite or supportive, they genuinely understood the value and impact of my work. James appeared at my side as I finished talking with family members. "Outstanding presentation," he said, with obvious pride. "I've already gotten calls from 3 potential clients who were in the audience." We spent the next hour at the conference networking reception, where I was introduced to executives, entrepreneurs, and fellow design professionals. The conversations felt natural and energizing rather than intimidating. I was representing not just myself, but the entire digital innovation division, which gave additional weight to my expertise and recommendation. The most significant conversation was with Elena Rodriguez, the Chief Technology Officer of a major healthcare network that was planning a comprehensive digital transformation initiative. "Morrison, your presentation addressed exactly the challenges we're facing with physician adoption of new systems. Would you be available for a consulting engagement?" The project she described would be the largest healthcare initiative our division had ever undertaken, involving multiple hospitals and affecting thousands of healthcare workers. It was exactly the kind of high-impact work that the Meridian Partnership had made possible. "Absolutely," I replied, exchanging contact information with Elena. "This sounds like a perfect fit for our healthcare technology focus." As the reception concluded, James and I walked my family to their cars in the convention center parking garage. The conversation during the walk reflected how dramatically family dynamics had shifted over the past 6 months. "Rachel, we want to plan a celebration dinner for your success," my mother announced, "something special to acknowledge how proud we are of what you've accomplished." "That would be wonderful, Mom," I replied, touched by the gesture. "And we want to invite James," my father added. "He's clearly been instrumental in your success, and we'd like to get to know him better." The inclusion of James in family celebrations felt significant because it represented acceptance of him, not just as my business partner, but as someone whose relationship with me was valued by the family. As we said goodbye, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Rachel, I want to apologize again for all the years I didn't take your work seriously. Seeing you up there today, I realize I was completely wrong about what you were building." "Marcus, we've moved past that," I said. "What matters now is that we understand each other." "Still," he insisted, "I want you to know that I'm genuinely proud to be your brother, and not just because of the financial success, but because of the impact you're having on people's lives through your work." Driving home from the conference with James, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that holiday dinner, when he revealed the Meridian acquisition. The transformation hadn't just been financial or professional, it had been personal and relational. "How does it feel?" James asked, as we navigated through downtown traffic. "Surreal," I admitted. "A year ago, my family barely understood what I did for a living. Today, they were in the front row cheering while I gave a keynote presentation to 800 industry professionals." "That's not surreal," James pointed out. "That's growth, both yours and theirs." He was right. The family dinner revelation had created space for everyone to reconsider their assumptions and expectations. My parents had learned to value different kinds of success. My siblings had discovered that innovation and tradition could coexist. I had gained confidence in the significance and impact of my work. "What's next?" James asked, as we pulled into my apartment complex. "Elena Rodriguez's healthcare project, for starters," I replied. "But beyond that, I think we're just getting started. The Digital Innovation Division feels like a platform for building something even bigger." "Agreed," James said with satisfaction. "And Rachel, I want you to know that working with you continues to be the most rewarding professional experience I've had. Watching you step into this level of leadership and recognition has been incredibly fulfilling." As I walked into my apartment that evening, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The challenges and frustrations of building Morrison Design Studios had prepared me for the opportunities that Meridian provided. The family relationships that had once felt limiting had evolved into sources of support and encouragement. The phone calls that came over the next few weeks reflected the new reality. Elena Rodriguez's healthcare project moved forward with a substantial contract. My mother called to share articles about digital design that she had found interesting. Marcus scheduled his consultation about improving client experience at his accounting firm. Emma asked for help with the school district's parent communication system. Each conversation reinforced that the transformation was lasting rather than temporary. My family's understanding of my work had deepened beyond the initial shock of financial success to genuine appreciation for the problem-solving and innovation involved. 3 months later, I received a call from the conference organizer asking if I would be the keynote speaker for next year's Digital Innovation Summit. The invitation felt like confirmation that my professional reputation had reached a level where I was recognized as a thought leader, rather than just a successful practitioner. When I shared the news with my family during our monthly dinner, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. My father suggested that they should plan to attend again, maybe bringing some friends who would be interested in the topic. My mother asked if I would be willing to speak at her book club about how design thinking could apply to community organization. The evolution from family disappointment to respected expert had been more dramatic than I could have imagined when James first whispered about the Meridian acquisition. But more importantly, it had created space for authentic relationships based on mutual understanding and respect, rather than judgment and expectation. As I looked around the dinner table at my family's faces reflecting genuine pride and interest in my work, I realized that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with someone willing to change the narrative entirely. James had done that by revealing information that forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions. But the lasting change had come from all of us choosing to build something better on that foundation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.